It's 9:14 on a Tuesday night, and you're sitting at your kitchen table with a calculator app open and a rent envelope in front of you. The overhead light is too bright for how tired you are. Your checking account says $340. Rent is $310 of that. On your wrist is a scratched-up digital watch your grandfather gave you the summer before he died. The kind you can buy new for $11, except this one isn't new, and it isn't for sale. Your phone buzzes. A group chat. Marcus and Priya are at the taco place 2 blocks over, the one with the good salsa verde. You type, "Can't tonight," and put the phone face down. You're 24. You have $1,200 in a savings account you started 8 months ago, and no one in your life would call you disciplined. You'd call it something closer to scared. Here's the part nobody tells you at the beginning. The years it takes to build real money are the same years everything else is happening. The dinners, the spontaneous trips, the Sunday mornings you could have slept in next to someone. You don't know it yet, but you're not just going to build a number. You're going to spend something to get it. The watch was your grandfather's idea of a joke, sort of. He gave it to you at 14 and said, "Time's the only thing you can't buy back, so you might as well know what time it is." You didn't understand it then. You wore it because it was his. At 24, you're making $41,000 a year doing logistics coordination for a regional trucking company. Rent is $310 because you live with 2 roommates in a house that smells faintly of the previous tenant's cat. Your car is a 2009 Corolla with 161,000 miles and a check engine light that's been on so long you've stopped noticing it. The first real decision happens on a Thursday. Your coworker Dave, mid-30s, drives a leased 5 Series, always first to buy around, tells you about a Roth IRA like he's letting you in on a secret. "Put in what you can," he says. "Even $50. You open an account that weekend. You move $50. It feels like nothing. It feels like throwing a coin into a well you can't see the bottom of. 2 months later, a wheel bearing goes out on the Corolla, $412. You don't have it, not really. You pull it from savings and watch the $1,200 become $788, and you feel something close to grief for a number you'd only known for 8 months. This is what nobody photographs. Not the $50 transfers. Not the moment you decide to bring lunch instead of buying it 4 days a week, because $9 a day is $180 a month, and $180 a month is real. You start doing this math constantly, a low hum underneath every purchase. A coffee isn't $4.75 anymore. It's 4 coffees you won't be able to buy in December. Marcus doesn't do this math. Marcus makes about what you make, works at a marketing agency, and believes, genuinely, not carelessly, that your 20s are for living, not spreadsheets. He buys a used jet ski in June. You don't judge him. He's not reckless. He's having a version of fun you've decided to postpone, and neither of you knows yet which version costs more. By December, the account is $2,340. It is not a fortune. It is the first proof that the system works, and it's the last year money will feel this simple. 2 years pass and nothing happens. That's the honest way to say it. You get a raise, $44,500, then $47,000. You automate $75 a payday into the Roth, then $125. You pay off a $2,900 credit card balance that had been quietly accumulating interest at 22%, and once it's gone, you redirect that same monthly payment straight into investing. Nobody notices. There's no ceremony for paying off a credit card. You just stop having one. Your coworker Elena, who's 51 and has worked in dispatch longer than you've been alive, says one thing to you in the break room that you don't think about again for years. You're complaining about a market dip. Your account had dropped $340 in a week, and it felt like watching water drain out of a tub. She doesn't look up from her sandwich. The money that scares you now is the same money that won't mean anything to you later. That's the whole point of it. You nod like you understood. You didn't, not really. You file it away. The Corolla dies for real at 187,000 miles. Not dramatically, just a transmission that finally gives up outside a grocery store. You buy a 5-year-old Civic in cash, $9,800, most of your emergency fund. Marcus asks why you didn't finance it. You've got the credit for it, he says not unkindly. You tell him you'd rather owe nobody. He shrugs and goes back to talking about the new watch he just bought. A real one, a Tag Heuer, $2,100, to celebrate a promotion. You still wear your grandfather's $11 watch. It still works fine. Somewhere in here, you meet Sam. She works in occupational therapy, has her own modest 401k, and doesn't ask about your finances for the first 4 months you're together, which you appreciate because you're not sure how to explain a habit that looks, from the outside, like nothing at all. By the time you're 26, the invested total, Roth, a small brokerage account, a 401k match you finally started using properly, crosses $19,000. It happened on a Sunday morning. You were making coffee. You didn't tell anyone. There was nothing to announce. The account grew the way grass grows, invisibly, until suddenly the lawn needs mowing. That's when the market drops 14% in 6 weeks. $19,000 becomes $16,340 in the span of a month and a half, and this is where the theory stops being theory. You check the account 4 times a day. Sam finds you doing it at midnight and doesn't say anything, just puts a hand on your shoulder and goes to bed. Dave, at the office, is telling anyone who'll listen that he got out in time. Sold everything in his 401k the week before the drop. Moved it to cash. You don't say what you're thinking, which is that he sold low and he'll buy back in high, because that's what fear always ends up doing to money. You don't sell. You're not sure why exactly. It's not confidence, it's closer to stubbornness. Elena's sentence comes back to you unprompted, at 1 a.m., staring at a red number on your phone. The money that scares you now is the same money that won't mean anything to you later. You leave it alone. You even, on a Tuesday that takes more nerve than anything you'd done with money before, increase your contribution by $50 a paycheck, because the fund shares are cheaper now than they were in March. It's the first time you've made a financial decision that felt less like discipline and more like belief. 6 months after the bottom, the account isn't just back to $19,000. It's at $24,600. The drop that terrified you turned out to be the best 6 weeks of buying you'd ever have. That winter, your father calls about a knee replacement his insurance won't fully cover, $3,400 out of pocket. You cover it without touching your investments, out of a cash cushion you built specifically, because Elena once told you, offhand, the emergency fund isn't about emergencies. It's about never having to sell what's working. You don't tell your father where the money came from. He just says, "Thank you," and something in his voice makes you realize this is the first time money has done something other than solve your own problems. You're 28. The invested total is $61,000. For the first time, the number stops feeling like an abstraction and starts feeling like a wall between you and certain kinds of disaster. You don't know it yet, but it's also starting to become a wall between you and certain kinds of connection. Marcus gets engaged. The wedding is in Cabo. A destination thing, he calls it, half apologetic. Flights, hotel, a groomsman suit you don't own yet. Roughly $1,900 all in. You go, obviously. You've known him since freshman year of college, but you notice, on the flight home, that you spent more on that single trip than you invested in your entire first year of trying. You don't resent it, you just notice it. The math has gotten strange. A version of yourself from 4 years ago would have called $1,900 catastrophic. Now it barely dents anything. At 30, something shifts that you don't fully register until Elena points it out. You're at $147,000 invested. The market has an unusually strong year, up around 24%, and the portfolio grows by roughly $31,000 without you contributing a single additional dollar beyond your usual automated $700 a month. Your salary that year, after taxes, brought home somewhere around $52,000. The portfolio's growth alone came close to matching 2/3 of what you earned working full-time, every day, for a year. You do the math 3 times because you don't trust it the first 2. That's the crossover, Elena tells you when you finally mention it. It's not that you stop needing your job, it's that the job stops being the only engine. She says it like it's obvious. To her, it is. She crossed that line 15 years ago and has been quietly, unglamorously wealthy this whole time, driving the same Camry, never once mentioning it. Around the same time, a transmission problem forces you to look at your car budget, and you realize, almost as an afterthought, that you could pay cash for a new one without dipping meaningfully into the portfolio. You don't. You buy another used Civic instead, $11,200, and you feel the specific, quiet satisfaction of choosing not to spend money you clearly have. Dave gets a promotion to regional manager. New title, new office, new BMW X5 on a 72-month loan. On paper, he's doing better than you by every visible measure. He is not doing better than you. He's 4 years from 50 with a mortgage refinanced twice, a car payment, and a 401k he's still rebuilding from the year he panic sold. You don't say any of this to him. You don't need to. You just notice that the things you can now afford and choose not to buy are the exact things he's financing to look like he already has them. Sam moves in that spring. You split rent evenly, the way you've always insisted on with money. Fair, transparent, no secrets. She still doesn't ask about your accounts. One night you finally show her the number, mostly because you want to stop carrying it alone. She's quiet for a second. Then, so, why do you still drive a 12-year-old car's replacement? You don't have a clean answer. You're still working on one. At 32, the portfolio crosses $310,000, and for the first time, freedom stops being a hypothetical. It shows up in small refusals before it shows up in anything big. Your company offers a lateral move, more money, more hours, a title bump that would have thrilled you 5 years ago. You turn it down, not because you don't want the money, because you do the math and realize the extra $6,000 a year isn't worth 10 more hours a week of a life you're finally starting to enjoy having outside of work. Your manager is confused. Most people would kill for this, he says. You don't correct him. You just say you're good where you are, which is true in a way he doesn't have the context to understand. A pipe bursts in your father's basement that summer. A genuine emergency. $7,800 in repairs and mold remediation. His insurance is slow to process. You write the check without a single moment of hesitation, without checking a balance, without doing math at all. That absence of math is the whole point. 4 years earlier, this bill would have required a spreadsheet and a few sleepless nights. Now, it requires a phone call to your bank and nothing else. Marcus, meanwhile, is renovating a kitchen he financed at 8.9% because the equity line was basically free money, in his words. You don't judge him for it. He's not reckless. He genuinely believes the house will appreciate enough to make the math work, and it might. You just notice that his version of security and yours have started to look like 2 different currencies. You take a Tuesday off for no reason and go hiking with Sam instead of answering emails. It's the kind of thing that used to feel irresponsible. Now it feels like the entire point of the last 8 years. Here's what you're starting to understand, slowly. The freedom was never going to arrive as a single dramatic moment. It arrived as a string of small refusals nobody else could see. The promotion you didn't take, the car you didn't upgrade, the loan you didn't sign. Choosing to, instead of having to. It's the quietest transformation the money ever performed, and it's the one that mattered most. But freedom, it turns out, has a bill of its own, and you haven't seen it yet. Your father dies in October. Heart, sudden, no warning. You get the call at your desk on a Wednesday, and you don't remember driving home. At the funeral, you do the math you swore you'd never do at a funeral. How many Sunday dinners did you skip in your 20s because you were tired from a shift, or because you were trying to save $180 a month, or because Marcus and Priya's taco nights felt like a distraction from the plan? You can't get an exact number. You know it's not 0. You know some of those nights were with him, at a kitchen table you still remember the smell of. The portfolio, that same month, crosses $400,000. The number arrives with no ceremony, the way it always does, Except this time, the silence doesn't feel like discipline. It feels like an accusation. You realize, sitting in your father's empty garage a few weeks later, that you've become someone people describe as doing really well, without ever explaining what that phrase cost. You have money that could survive 18 months without a paycheck. You do not have the 18 months you spent building it back, the ones you spent choosing spreadsheets over Sundays, believing there'd always be more time on the other side of the number. Marcus calls, awkward and sincere, and says he wishes he'd known your dad better. You realize you wish the same thing, and you had every chance he didn't. Elena, at the office the next week, doesn't offer advice this time. She just says, nobody warns you that the discipline that builds the money is the same discipline that can cost you the years. She's not being cruel. She's finally telling you the rest of the sentence she gave you 6 years ago in the break room. You go home. Sam is there. You take off the watch, your grandfather's watch, the $11 one that's outlasted every phone you've owned, and you look at it for a long time before putting it back on. It still tells the same time it always has. It was never the money's job to give that back to you. You're 33 now, at a kitchen table again, though it's a different table in a different kitchen in a home you own with Sam. The watch is still on your wrist. The number in your accounts would have felt impossible to the version of you sitting at that first table 9 years ago, moving $50 into an account he couldn't picture the future of. That version of you thought the goal was the number. He thought if he could just get to $100,000, then $300,000, then whatever came after, the fear would end and something like peace would begin. He wasn't wrong about the peace. He just didn't know what it would be sitting next to. You still get the group texts. You answer more of them now. Not because you have more time exactly, but because you finally understand that the time was always the actual currency, and the dollars were only ever a way of buying some of it back. You can't buy back the Sundays you missed. You can only decide, from here, which ones you're going to keep. Your father's toolbox is in the garage. You haven't opened it yet. Some Tuesday soon, you will. The number in the account is real. So is what it costs to get there. Neither cancels the other out. That's the part nobody puts in the thumbnail. If this story made you think differently about what you're actually trading for the number in your account, hit like and subscribe. There's more of these coming. And I'm genuinely curious. What's one thing you'd want to make sure you don't lose on your way to getting there? Tell me in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.